Imagine standing in a house that has watched centuries pass, where the floorboards creak not from age, but from something they were forced to swallow whole. A silence so thick it presses against your ribs like cold iron. In the summer of 1987, beneath the innocent sunlight of the Shenandoah Valley, ordinary men lifted those boards, and the past rose up screaming. What they found wasn't just wood and dust. It was a secret soaked in guilt, sealed by sin, and guarded by the very earth itself, as if God had waited 140 years for someone to finally listen. This is the story of Bell Grove, and the moment history refused to stay buried. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists where something sacred has been deliberately hidden. Not the gentle hush of an empty church on a weekday afternoon. Not the peaceful quiet of a forgotten meadow. This silence is heavier. It has weight. It has breath. It clings to the skin like damp wool and makes the air taste metallic, as though the walls themselves are trying to warn you, turn back. Some doors were nailed shut for a reason. In the blistering summer of 1987, that silence waited patiently beneath the floors of Bell Grove Plantation. The estate sat like a proud, aging widow in the rolling hills of Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, 3 stories of Greek Revival grandeur built in 1797 by enslaved hands and Philadelphia architects who believed symmetry could hide any evil. White columns that had once gleamed like marble now wore a soft, sorrowful gray, streaked with a century of rain and regret. Tall windows stared out across 280 acres of land that had known cotton, tobacco, blood, and prayer in equal measure. The kind of house that looked beautiful in photographs, but felt watchful up close. The restoration crew arrived in battered pickup trucks, tools clanging, thermos coffee steaming. They were not ghost hunters or historians with degrees. They were ordinary working men, carpenters, masons, painters hired by the newly formed Bell Grove Foundation to peel back decades of progress and return the mansion to its 19th century soul. Rip out the cheap 1950s linoleum. Restore the original heart pine floors. Bring the house back to life. Or so they thought. Leading them was Thomas Garrett, 52 years old, built like a man who had spent his life wrestling with oak and history. His hands were scarred, his eyes the color of storm clouds over the Blue Ridge. Thomas didn't just restore houses, he listened to them. He could run his palm across a wall and tell you the year the plaster was mixed by the way the sand felt between his fingers. He had grown up in this valley, son of a carpenter father who taught him that every nail driven was a prayer, and a schoolteacher mother who made him read the Bible not for sermons, but for stories of men who thought they could bury their sins. Some houses remember, Thomas would say quietly while the crew unloaded. And some houses wait. His nephew David worked beside him, 28, strong-shouldered, still carrying the wide-eyed hunger of a young man who believed the past could be understood if you just looked hard enough. David had inherited his uncle's gift, the ability to see the story written in wood grain, in uneven joists, in the way a single brick was laid slightly out of line as if someone had been crying while they worked. The first week passed in the ordinary rhythm of demolition. Saws screaming. Dust hanging in shafts of golden light. The crew joked about ghosts and buried treasure the way men do when they're trying to laugh at the unease they already feel crawling up their spines. They pried up the modern flooring in the grand parlor first, layer after layer of cheap plywood and vinyl that smelled of mildew and forgotten cigarettes. Beneath it lay the original heart pine boards, dark with age, rich with the resin that still carried the faint scent of the forests they once grew in. Thomas knelt. Ran his calloused fingers along the seams. Something felt wrong. The boards here were tighter than they should have been. Almost fused. As if someone had wanted them to stay down forever. "Hand me the crowbar," he said, voice low. David passed it without a word. The rest of the crew gathered closer, the jokes dying on their lips. The only sound now was the distant wind moving through the ancient oaks outside and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a clock that had not been wound in decades yet seemed to keep perfect time today. Thomas wedged the bar. Levered gently. The first board resisted, then gave with a groan that sounded almost human, a long, reluctant sigh as if the house itself was exhaling something it had held for 140 years. Dust rose like incense. And beneath the board, they saw it. Not dirt. Not empty space. Something pale. Something wrapped. Something that had once been alive. The men froze. Thomas's breath caught. David's face drained of color. One of the younger workers crossed himself without thinking, an old Catholic habit he hadn't used since childhood. Because what lay beneath that floorboard wasn't construction debris. It was a small wooden box, no larger than a child's coffin. And from the scene where the lid met the base, a single strand of long, dark hair had worked its way free, swaying gently in the sudden draft like a finger beckoning them closer. The silence that fell then was the kind the Bible speaks of, the silence that comes right before judgment. Thomas looked up at the crew, his voice barely above a whisper. "Boys, I think we just found what this house never wanted us to see." But that was only the beginning. Because Bell Grove wasn't just any plantation. It had been built on land granted to the Ashton family in 1797, a family whose name still carried weight in the valley like an unspoken curse. A family that had grown rich on tobacco and cotton and the backs of people they claimed to own. A family that attended church every Sunday, sang hymns with tears in their eyes, and then went home to commit sins they believed God would never notice. The Shenandoah Valley in 1987 was trying to forget. The Civil War scars had faded into rolling farmland in tourist brochures. Lee's surrender at Appomattox was 122 years in the past. Yet the valley still carried the memory in its bones, in the way certain families never mixed, in the way old men still lowered their voices when they spoke of before the war, in the way some graveyards had two sections, one for the white stones with angels, and another for the unmarked plots where the enslaved were laid without even a name. Historic preservation was suddenly fashionable. Wealthy northern donors wrote checks. The National Trust sent experts. Old plantations were being reborn as museums, wedding venues, bed and breakfasts. Everyone wanted the romance of columns and verandas without the stain of what had happened inside those walls. Bell Grove was supposed to be the crown jewel. 3 stories of perfect proportion. A grand central hallway wide enough for carriages to turn. Ballroom chandeliers that had once reflected candlelight onto silk gowns and powdered wigs. But time had been cruel. Roofs leaked. Paint peeled in long curling strips like shed skin. Modern bathrooms had been carved into bedrooms where children once slept. The slave quarters, crumbling brick shells half a mile from the big house, stood like accusing witnesses no one wanted to look at directly. The foundation had paid a small fortune to the last Ashton descendant, a distant cousin who wanted nothing more than to sell and never speak of the place again. Grants flowed in. The plan was ambitious: full structural restoration, removal of every 20th century addition, return to 1797 glory. The work would take years. Cost hundreds of thousands. And it would, they all believed, finally lay the past to rest. They had no idea the past was about to lay them bare instead. Thomas Garrett had restored dozens of historic homes. He understood that every old building carries layers, not just of paint and wallpaper, but of memory, of grief, of sin. He had once found a slave's iron collar welded into a chimney during a restoration in Charlottesville. Another time, love letters from 1842 hidden behind a mantelpiece that spoke of a forbidden romance between an overseer's daughter and an enslaved man. Each discovery had left its mark on him. But this felt different. This felt personal. As the crew stood in that parlor, staring at the small wooden box half revealed beneath the floor, the air grew colder despite the July heat outside. One man later swore he heard a woman's voice, soft, almost lullaby-like, humming at him from somewhere deep in the walls. Another said the hair on the box moved again, as if stirred by breath. Thomas reached down. His fingers trembled only slightly as they brushed the lid. He didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, he looked around at the men who had become more than workers, they had become witnesses. "Whatever is in here," he said quietly, "God saw it happen. And now He's asking us to see it too." The box stayed closed that afternoon. They covered it respectfully with a clean cloth, like you would a body on a battlefield. They nailed the board back down loosely. They went outside and smoked cigarettes with shaking hands. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Because every one of them, these practical, hard-working Virginia men, felt the same thing in their chests. They had not just lifted floorboards. They had lifted the lid on a century of silence. And somewhere in the shadows of Bell Grove, something that had waited in darkness for 140 years, was finally ready to speak. The restoration had only just begun. But the reckoning? The reckoning had already arrived. David had known since he was 12 that houses hold more than timber and plaster. His uncle Thomas had shown him how to read them, the way a crooked joist might mean a hasty repair after a storm, or after something violent. The way certain rooms stay colder than physics can explain. David had apprenticed under Thomas for 5 long years, learning not just to cut dovetails and plain edges, but to listen. To feel the weight of decisions made in silence a century earlier. By 1987 he was no longer the wide-eyed boy trailing his uncle through dusty attics. He was a craftsman in his own right, steady hands, quiet pride, and a growing sense that every old building carried at least one wound it refused to show the daylight. The rest of the crew completed the circle of witnesses. Marcus Webb, 63, born and raised in the shadow of these same Blue Ridge Hills. He knew the valley the way a man knows the scars on his own palms. 40 years swinging hammers, laying brick, framing barns. He could tell you which families still owned the land their great-grandfathers stole, which roads had been built over old burying grounds, which wells had once tasted of iron and regret. Marcus didn't talk much about the past unless someone asked, and even then, he spoke in half-sentences, as though the full truth might summon it back. James Patterson, 24, fresh from Richmond with the restless energy of youth that hadn't yet learned caution. He moved fast, laughed loud, and occasionally forgot that history doesn't forgive shortcuts. Thomas kept him on a short leash, correcting him gently but firmly, "We don't rush the dead, son. They've waited long enough already." Robert Chen, the mason, 38, brought in from Fredericksburg for the brickwork and stone foundations. He spoke little, worked with the patience of someone who understood that time itself is a material. He could hold a single brick up to the light and tell you whether it came from the kilns of Richmond in 1805 or Baltimore in 1832, just by the color of the clay, the size of the frog, the faint imprint of a thumb pressed into it 2 centuries ago. Robert believed walls remember hands. He treated every course of brick like a prayer. And then there was Bill Hutchkins, Big Bill to the crew, 46, broad as a barn door, the man who carried the weight so others didn't have to. He hauled lumber, ripped out rotted subflooring, swept mountains of dust without complaint. His humor was dry as summer lightning, quick, sharp, and just dark enough to remind everyone they were working in a place that had seen worse days than this one. They started in early June, the Virginia heat already pressing down like judgment. The main floor came first, parlor, dining room, entrance hall. Layers of 1950s linoleum, yellowed and brittle, glued down with adhesive that smelled like regret and gasoline. Beneath that, wall-to-wall carpet from the 1960s, matted with decades of footsteps that had tried to walk away from what happened here. The crew tore it all up with crowbars and utility knives, revealing the original heart pine boards, wide-planked, dark with age, still carrying the ghost scent of turpentine and tobacco smoke. Most days felt ordinary in their exhaustion. Blisters. Backaches. Dust that coated the tongue and settled in the lungs like fine ash. They found the usual relics of careless decades, a 1952 wheat penny flattened under heel, a child's glass marble rolling out from under a baseboard, a brass button stamped with a Confederate star that someone had once worn proudly. Thomas photographed each one, measured, catalogued, wrote notes in a battered spiral notebook. He treated every find like evidence in a trial no one had yet called to order. But the house was patient. It let them grow comfortable. Let them believe this would be just another job, beautiful, hard, but ultimately harmless. Then came the morning of June 23rd. Second floor. The master bedroom, a cavernous space that had once held 4-poster beds, silk canopies, whispered secrets between husband and wife, prayers before sleep, perhaps screams no one outside ever heard. The windows here faced east, dawn light poured in gold and merciless, illuminating every crack and seam. David and Marcus worked side by side, pry bars in hand, moving methodically from the fireplace toward the far wall. Board after board came up with the expected resistance, nails groaning, wood splintering just enough to remind them they were intruders. Until one didn't. David wedged the bar under the edge of a 12-inch wide plank near the center of the room. He levered gently, expecting the familiar fight. Instead, the board lifted almost willingly, smooth, silent, as though the nails had rusted away on purpose. As though someone, long ago, had wanted this particular piece of floor to come free without a struggle. David froze. The pry bar stayed where it was, half lifted. Marcus, kneeling opposite, looked up slowly. Their eyes met across the open gap. In that single shared glance, something unspoken passed between them, not fear, not yet, but recognition. The kind a man feels when he realizes the story he's been told his whole life has left out the most important chapter. David lowered the bar. He reached down with bare fingers and lifted the plank the rest of the way. No creak. No protest. Just a soft sigh of displaced air, cool, damp, carrying the faint, unmistakable sweetness of old cedar and something else, something organic, long preserved. Beneath the board lay darkness, but not empty darkness. A narrow cavity, no more than 6 inches deep, had been carefully cut between the joists. The edges were clean, deliberate, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were hiding and how long they needed it to stay hidden. Inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle with age, rested a small bundle. Not large. Not ostentatious. But heavy with intent. David's breath caught. Marcus whispered something under his breath, a fragment of an old prayer, half remembered from childhood revivals. From downstairs came the distant sounds of the others, James laughing at something Bill said, Robert tapping mortar with a trowel, the low hum of a radio playing gospel faintly through the open windows. Up here, though, the world had narrowed to 6 inches of shadow and a single oilcloth shroud. David looked at Marcus again. Neither man moved to touch it. Because both of them understood, in the marrow of their bones, that whatever lay wrapped in that cloth had not been lost. It had been placed. With care. With purpose. With the full knowledge that one day, perhaps today, someone would come looking. And when that day arrived, the house would have no choice but to answer. David finally spoke, voice so low it barely carried past his lips. Uncle Thomas needs to see this. Marcus only nodded. They didn't call the others up yet. They didn't dare. Because some truths are too heavy to share all at once. Some sins need to be met in silence first, face to face with the men who must decide whether to bury them again, or let them finally speak. The board remained lifted. The bundle waited. And Bell Grove, for the first time in nearly a century and a half, exhaled the breath it had been holding. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was expectant. It was holy. And it was terrifying. Marcus Webb knelt first, knees cracking against the pine like old bones settling into prayer. His face, lined by 40 years of Virginia sun and secrets, tightened as he stared into the gap. That ain't natural, he murmured, voice low and rough as river gravel. Not anger. Not fear. Something deeper, the weariness of a man who has lived long enough to recognize when history decides it's tired of hiding. The cavity was no accident of rot or settling. 2 feet long, 8 inches wide, carved clean between the joists with a chisel or drawknife edges still sharp enough to cut memory. Someone had taken time. Someone had measured. Someone had lined the hollow with oilcloth, once waxed canvas the color of fresh cream, now brittle and yellow as old parchment. The cloth had been folded with care, corners tucked like hospital sheets, forming a cradle meant to preserve, not discard. Whoever made this hiding place had not been in a hurry. They had been afraid. David stayed frozen on his knees, hands hovering, palms up as though receiving communion. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The room had grown smaller, the air heavier, pressing against the ribs like the weight of unspoken sin. From the 3rd floor came the slow, measured tread of boots on stairs. Thomas Garrett appeared in the doorway, silhouette framed by the hallway's gloom. He did not rush. He never rushed toward the unknown. His eyes, storm gray, steady, took in the scene without blinking, David kneeling, Marcus standing sentinel, the open wound in the floor, the oilcloth glowing faintly in the dustlit beam like a wound dressing long overdue for changing. He stepped inside. Stopped. Studied. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Thomas said, quiet as scripture, don't touch anything else. Not yet. What followed was not demolition. It was reverence. Thomas fetched his old Nikon from the truck, the same camera he used to document every nail hole, every layer of paint, every scar the house had worn. He worked methodically, almost liturgically. First the floorboard in place, click. Then lifted, click. The cavity from above, click. From the side, click. Close on the oilcloth folds, click. He moved around the opening like a priest circling an altar, capturing every angle, every shadow, every telltale sign of human intent. In his notebook he sketched the cavity's dimensions in precise pencil lines, noted the nail holes, 4 per side, hand-forged, slightly countersunk, the wood species, heart pine, quarter sawn, the faint saw marks on the joist edges, rip saw, not circular, pre-1850. He understood what archaeologists know: the moment you remove something from context, half its truth vanishes forever. Only when every photograph had been taken, every measurement recorded, every detail committed to paper did he kneel. His hands, scarred, steady, reached down. The first item he lifted was a leather-bound journal. The cover, once black, had softened to the color of dried blood under long exposure. Cracked along the spine, yet supple, oiled, perhaps, in secret moments of care. The pages inside were thick rag paper, yellow to the hue of old bone, edges frayed but not crumbling. Handwriting filled them, elegant, feminine, precise copperplate and iron gall ink faded to sepia but still sharp enough to cut. Sentences marched in perfect rows, as though the writer had believed order could contain chaos. The second item, a bundle of letters, perhaps 15 or 20, tied with a ribbon that had once been sky blue silk. Now it was the gray of spent ashes. The envelopes, thin, almost translucent, bore the same handwriting on their faces. Addresses written in full formality: "To my beloved," the paper inside crinkled like dry leaves when Thomas lifted the packet, as though the words themselves were restless after so long in darkness. The third, a small wooden box, no larger than a man's palm. Mahogany, or perhaps walnut darkened by time and touch. A simple geometric inlay, cross-hatched ebony and ivory, framed the lid. A brass clasp, green with verdigris, held it shut. Locked. No key among the other items. No key anywhere in sight. Thomas placed each object on a clean dropcloth he had spread across the floorboards, white canvas, like a surgeon's drape. He arranged them with care: journal to the left, letters in the center, box to the right. Then he stepped back. The three men stood in silence around this small altar of secrets. Sunlight slanted lower now, turning the dust to gold fireflies. Outside, a mockingbird called once, sharp and mocking, then fell quiet, as though even the birds understood the gravity of what had been unearthed. Thomas's voice, when it came, was soft but carried the weight of verdict. "These weren't lost," he said. "They were hidden. Someone put them here knowing they might never be found, or hoping they would be, when the time was right." Marcus nodded slowly. "Time's right now." David stared at the locked box. "What if we're not supposed to open it?" Thomas looked at his nephew, really looked, the way a man looks at someone he has raised from boy to witness. "Then why did the floorboard lift so easy?" he asked. "Why did this house wait for us?" No one answered. Because the question wasn't for them. It was for the house, and the house, with its tall windows staring blindly across the valley, with its columns that had witnessed baptisms and whippings in the same breath, with its walls that had absorbed every prayer and every curse, had already answered. The journal lay closed. The letters remained tied. The box stayed locked. But the silence in that room was no longer empty. It was listening. It was waiting. And somewhere deep in the marrow of Bell Grove, a debt long overdue was beginning to be called due. The reckoning had not just arrived. It had been invited in. They had found accusation. Marcus broke the silence first, voice low and cracked like dry earth. "We can't keep this between us." His hands, steady for 40 years of hammer and nail, trembled now like a child's. "This ain't ours to decide. This needs experts. Preservation. People who know how to handle ghosts." Thomas nodded once, slow, deliberate. His mind had already raced ahead, through phone calls, historical societies, university archives, the inevitable questions that would come like locusts. But before any outsider crossed the threshold, before the world claimed these secrets as history, he needed to know what sin had been buried here. Just a glimpse, he told himself. Just enough to measure the gravity. Just enough to know whether what lay inside deserved daylight, or deserved to be sealed again forever. He knelt. The leather journal felt warm against his palms, impossibly warm, as though it still carried the fever of the hand that last closed it. The cover resisted at first, stiff with decades of compression, then yielded with a soft crack like breaking bone. The first page was blank, a merciful pause. The second bore only a title, written in the same elegant copperplate that had addressed the letters. A true account of events at Bell Grove in the year of our Lord 1863. Written by Katherine Ashton, wife of Henry Ashton. In the hope that truth might survive even when justice cannot. Thomas felt the words enter him like cold iron. Katherine Ashton. The name was etched into the valley's memory like a scar. Mistress of Bell Grove during the war years, a woman whose portrait still hung in the downstairs hall, pale skin, dark eyes, mouth set in the thin line of someone who had learned to smile without meaning it. He turned the page with the care one uses to handle a dying thing. The first entry was dated March 15, 1863. He read the opening lines aloud, voice barely louder than breath. I have committed an act today that will haunt me until my dying breath. The weight of what I have done presses upon my chest like a millstone, and I fear that God himself has turned his face away. I write this not in hope of forgiveness, for I know I deserve none, but as a record. Someone must know. Someone must remember what was done here in the name of preserving a way of life already bleeding to death. The room temperature seemed to plummet. Sweat cooled instantly on their necks. Outside, the other workers continued their ordinary labor, Saws whining, Bill's low laugh carrying up the stairs, Robert tapping mortar into place with rhythmic patience. But up here, in this chamber where a woman once slept beside her husband and woke to nightmares she herself had authored, the world had narrowed to 3 men and 1 voice from the grave. Thomas kept reading, voice steady but quieter with each sentence, as though the words themselves demanded hush. Katherine wrote of the war's shadow falling long across Virginia. Of Union troops rumored to be moving up the valley. Of her husband Henry, away fighting for a cause she no longer believed in. Of the enslaved people still bound to Bell Grove, men, women, children who worked the fields under the whip even as the Confederacy crumbled. And then, in careful, measured sentences that never once excused herself, she described the act. Not in lurid detail. Not in hysteria. In cold precision. A young woman named Eliza, house slave, no more than 19, had been accused of stealing silver. A spoon, perhaps 2. Enough to feed rumor. Enough to justify punishment. But Katherine knew the accusation was false. Knew it had been planted by an overseer who coveted Eliza for darker reasons. Knew, too, that Henry, before leaving for the front, had given standing orders: any theft meant the lash. Public. Exemplary. Katherine could have spoken. Could have stopped it. Instead, in the name of order, in the name of protecting the household from scandal, in the name of a way of life she now saw as rotting from within, she had remained silent. The punishment was carried out in the yard behind the smokehouse. 30 lashes. Eliza did not cry out. She sang a hymn, soft and unbroken, until the final stroke. Then she was carried away. 2 days later she was dead. Fever. Or heartbreak. Or both. Katherine wrote, I stood at the window and watched. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself God would understand the necessity of order. But when they cut her down, her back no longer looked human. And in that moment I knew, the order I preserved was the order of hell. The entry ended with a single line, underlined twice. I buried her Bible beneath the floorboards of this room. Let it testify when I cannot. Thomas closed the journal gently. His hands shook now too. Marcus whispered, Lord have mercy. David stared at the locked box as though it might contain the rest of Eliza's story, or perhaps her bones. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Finally Thomas spoke, voice rough with something close to anger. We're not equipped for this. Not yet. He pulled the old rotary phone from the hallway, the one the Foundation had left for emergencies, and dialed a number he still knew by heart. Dr. Eleanora Hayes answered on the second ring. She was a professor at the University of Virginia, specialist in antebellum social history, author of 2 books on the hidden lives of enslaved women in the Shenandoah. Thomas had worked with her once before, on a smaller project in Albemarle County. She had handled fragile documents with the same reverence he used on irreplaceable wood. She listened without interruption as he described, carefully, vaguely, what they had found. A hidden cavity. A journal. Letters. A locked box. Dated 1863. Personal. Painful. "I can be there by 9 tomorrow morning," she said immediately. "Do not touch anything else. Do not open the box. Do not read further. Leave everything exactly where it is. I'll bring acid-free tissue, archival boxes, gloves, the works." And Thomas, her voice softened, almost tender. "Whatever is in there, it waited 124 years for you to find it. Don't rush its telling." He hung up. The 3 men looked at one another. Outside, the cicadas kept screaming, a sound like mourning that never quite becomes tears. Inside, the journal lay closed again. The letters remained tied. The box stayed locked. But the house no longer felt empty. It felt awake. And in the quiet between heartbeats, if you listen closely, you could almost hear it, a woman's voice, soft as him singing, repeating one line over and over. "Someone must remember." The workers downstairs finished their day unaware. Upstairs, 3 men stood vigil over a sin that had finally found its witnesses. Tomorrow, the historian would come. Tomorrow, the truth would be handled with white cotton gloves and careful questions. But tonight Bell Grove belonged to the dead. And the dead were no longer content to stay buried.